first of all, thanks to everybody for coming today. Thanks to Liv and to Dr. McKay and the Center for Faculty Innovation for inviting me to be part of their series. I'm flattered and pleased. And so today we're going to talk some about open access and digital depositories. And there is a movement underway in the world, in the publishing world, that is changing the way that scholarly information is circulated. Come on in, Dave.
Thank you.
And what's happening is that many traditional publications that have been produced in print and distributed physically are starting to move over to the digital world. And in some cases, we have a model that's the same as what we've seen for decades, where there's a fee for subscription and that users are limited based on either their own or their institution's ability to provide for them. But what's happening now is that we're seeing a transition to some other additional models. We don't know yet where we're going, whether all publications are going to move this direction or whether it's just a part-time thing, whether we'll see some but not all publications move in this direction. Open access is often defined as the ability to use materials and publications without need for either payment or any kind of authentication. So you don't necessarily have to be a member of an organization, a university, a society, or a group in order to use these materials, and they are primarily found in digital format on the internet. Lately, there's talk of two different kinds of open access, green and gold, and this is fairly new to me too. In green open access, the author publishes in a conventional journal with a copy then going to a repository either at their institution or elsewhere. Gold open access means the author pays a fee and the journal is archived. So in both cases, the material is available, but maybe one a little later than the other. Some open access follows an embargo period. We hate to use that word in the library, but that means that there's a period of time during which the material is not available. And then after a certain number of either months or maybe years have elapsed, then the material becomes available. Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, for example, is open to everybody after 6 months. But because that's so important, we still subscribe to it to provide those most recent 6 months of access. Did you have a question, Jim?
Well, the embargo means you still have access to it as a member of the society or whatever.
Well, it depends on the publisher and how they do it. It might be by subscription, like PNAS is. We pay a fee, and not only do we get the back files, but we also get the most recent 6 months. And that's a rolling 6 months. So, after the additional 7th month has elapsed, then that first month goes into public access. Some embargo periods are considerably longer, year, 2 years. I've seen 3 years. That's not unusual. So it's good to have those back issues, but we certainly, especially in the sciences, need the most current information first. But yeah, and as questions come up, please feel free to ask them. The first journal published, I verified this, was the Journal des Savants in 1665 in Paris, followed 3 months later by the Royal Society. The French got there first. Journals have been the primary way that scholars have communicated around the world. In time, those society publications were supplemented by commercial publications mostly in the 1800s. And of course, by the 1900s, that had exploded enormously as hundreds and even thousands of new journals appeared, millions upon millions of articles became available, but again, for a fee. Most institutions, like our library, can only afford to subscribe to a limited number of titles. So we try to do the best we can based on what we see as the research needs of students as well as the research needs of faculty. But what we found, and this was a real crisis for us in the 90s, was that the rate of increase of costs of those journals, subscription costs, well outpaced the consumer price index. So we found ourselves looking at an increasingly smaller budget for books. And what we did was to be more aggressive in reviewing our journal subscriptions, especially in print, because those were the most expensive. So we've been able to, I think, balance pretty well over time the needs of disciplines that are driven more by books, the liberal arts, for example, as well as the disciplines that are more driven by journal publications like the sciences. Costs for journals have been paid not only by subscribers, but in some cases by authors with per-page charges. As the number of scholars has increased, certainly the number of journals will continue to increase. More and more of us are doing research, also going up for promotion and for tenure, and how important is it to have a good group of publications under your belt. At about the same time, over the last 20 years or so, technology has been expanding our ability to communicate with one another. First, the computer networks were developed that spanned states and then regions. Those became interconnected, and now we have a global network with considerable redundancy, thank goodness. So if this section goes out or this cable goes out, there's still ways to get around so that we can access servers in Japan and China, Australia, England, Sweden, and provide access to materials there and give them access to materials here as well. In the 1990s, many peer-reviewed scholarly journals began to appear on the internet. In 1990, the Electronic Journal of Communication, Postmodern Culture, and the Bryn Mawr Classical Review, all peer-reviewed, began publication. So that's quite a record there, 20 years worth. Other disciplines handled that communication in some slightly different ways. Physics and mathematics, for example, set up an archive, the arxiv.org service, where they placed preprints and postprints of articles so that researchers could view those as well. Some universities began to get involved. Johns Hopkins in 1993 with the Project Muse, which we subscribe to. Stanford University produced their Highwire service. And many of these projects became open in their access, and more people expressed interest in that. George Soros's Open Society Institute in 2001, they met in Budapest, and that resulted in a call for all scholarly material to be freely available. Certainly an ambitious goal. Also in the 90s and early 2000s, many people who acted as editors and referees for scientific journals decided that they would prefer to work open access and left. There was a famous one, Vegetatio, published by Elsevier, where almost the entire editorial board quit and decided to found their own open access journal, the Journal of Vegetation Science, and that was back in, I don't have the date on that, the early 2000s anyway. Another question, I think, in many authors' minds was who holds the rights, especially the copyrights, to publications. When I write in certain journals, the copyright does not devolve back to me, but remains with the journal and with the publisher, sometimes for a limited period and sometimes indefinitely. So that gives me little or no control over what I can do with that material. So there's another kind of force pushing people away towards the more traditional model of publications. Biological and medical fields have, I think, been in the forefront here. The U.S. National Library of Medicine maintains PubMed Central, which is a large repository of open access journals. Biomed Central is actually another similar service, but it is the nonprofit Springer publisher that provides that service, although they publish 212 peer-reviewed open access journals. Mentioned Stanford and their Highwire Press. They have 47 open journals, and 283 titles with free back issues, that is, once that embargo period has expired. And they're bragging about 2 million free articles that they provide now, which is really kind of amazing. The Lund universities in Sweden maintain a directory of open access journals where anybody can look to see if there is a journal in their field. This is a great place to look for publication opportunities. They cover all the subject areas, natural sciences, social sciences, humanities, and arts as well. And it's an international list. There are just as many journals, I think, outside the United States as there are in. And the list that I've given you has the address for the Directory of Open Access Journals. The United Nations, World Health Organizations, has created the Hinari site, which has free and low-cost access to journals primarily for third world researchers and practitioners. So there's a little different spin on it. They're not available to everybody on the same access or on equal footing, but they are available to researchers in the countries that are the least advantaged as far as subscription accesses go as well. Now, I mentioned repositories or depositories, which in my mind means pretty much the same thing. That's where the material is going to be kept. Either the publisher is going to operate that may be the society, it may be the commercial publisher, or it may be the author's institution. Many larger schools, like the University of Kansas, maintain a university repository, and publications by authors at the university go into that repository where they are then available freely to folks. Loyola is a participant in something called the Louisiana Digital Library, and I'm going to show you that before we all get out of here. We have posted not only numerous students' honors theses, and thanks to biology for steering so many students in our direction for that, but also some other archival materials such as some Jesuit materials, and there's a nice collection of guidebooks for the city of New Orleans that's kind of fun to look at as well. There's something called the Directory of Open Access Repositories, or Open Door, which maintains a list of about 1,800 such repositories around the world. And there's another project called Oyster, which is O-A-I-S-T-E-R, not the more traditional spelling that we're used to. You can go to Oyster and search for material that is available publicly in these repositories. So for example, our students' master's theses, when the student has signed the agreement allowing its use outside the school, can be found in this index. There are questions and concerns about what open access means, and I know faculty especially have some of those questions. We want to ensure the highest level of publications. Will these publications be accepted by our peers, especially at promotion and tenure review time? If a fee is charged, who will pay it? And I know Dr. Dorn has some comments about that as well. How will the work be available to the public? Who's going to know about it? How will people get to it? And then will colleagues read and cite their publications? And there's been a very interesting study that's just been released on that as well. Faculty at several universities have made their intentions clear, voting to provide a school-wide preference so that faculty publications, unless there's an opt-out, are automatically open accessed and archived, in the Kansas case, at the university as well. Commercial publishers have decided that this is definitely a trend that needs to be paid attention to. Some commercial publications have actually gone open access, and some other publishers, most recently the Nature Publishing Group, they announced about 2 months ago that they would start their own open access journal. It's called Scientific Reports, and it will begin in the summer of 2011. It will be peer-reviewed and it will be rapid publication. It's modeled after the Public Library of Science, or PLOS-1, which is probably the most successful open access scientific journal. It publishes about 7,000 articles per year. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague.
Thank you. Do you all have any questions for Tim?
Yeah,
I'll just,
be glad to hear.
make the observation. To me, open access is open access.
Mm-hmm.
No embargo, no nothing.
Right.
It means it is there. 5 seconds after they punched the button and they put it there. But I am shocked how much people don't understand the difference between peer review or lack of peer review and open access. I see lots of, I'm on lots of listserv blogs, well, they don't call them listserv anymore, blogs for these professional societies. Someone brings up, you know, especially younger, for the most part, younger scientists and younger people in their careers just saying, every journal ought to be open access. If it isn't, it should go extinct, and we should just populate the open access journals. And the responses back always include some folks saying, oh, well, you know, peer review means something. And in my view, those are totally different things.
Right.
It's just mind-boggling to me.
Yeah, open access
still
and peer review are not incompatible. The best open access is peer reviewed, certainly. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, I can create Craig's, you know, Craig Hood's website.com, you know, and that's meaningless. But the fact that, but that's not what we're talking about. And it's really unbelievable to me that Public Library of Science, for example, all the journals they do, and not every single journal within close, but several of them are now are viewed, even though they're only 4 or 5 years old, some of them about 10 years old, as just right there with science and nature, like the big kahuna, like that's where you want to get your papers, and it's impossible to get your papers in there unless you really have great stuff. So I find it just perplexing that otherwise intelligent academics think that every
Confusing those
open
issues.
access
Yeah.
is
We're still in a
no
transitional
peer review.
period. I mean, we're really only going back about 20 years or so with the publication of most of these journals, and it's still not fixed in everybody's mind that open access can mean peer review and high quality, and should mean that.
Do you see any kind of trend amongst, say, the Tier 1 research institutions where tenure and promotion is based almost not much on a citation index as it is on the so-called reputation of the journal? One way of getting around peer review could be number of times a paper cited, and then that's used as a device versus the traditional peer review process, kind of totally circumventing. In other words, the users become the peer reviewers. Do you see any kind of trend like that?
I think it may be too early to tell whether tenure review committees are putting as much weight on numbers of citations. But what's interesting is this study that Dr. Dorn's going to talk about. One of the findings is that people love to read peer review or open access journals, but they're not as enthusiastic about citing them. So what exactly does that mean? That's a little confusing in my mind about the importance to them of those. I mean, they're easy to read, they're free to read, you know, you don't have to go over to the library, you don't have to pay, you don't have to go through a paywall to get to it, but yeah.
One more question. I mean, in most of the journals that I use the most frequently are published by various kinds of professional societies.
Right.
And and they have controlled the distribution of that based upon memberships to libraries and individuals. Do you see the open access as a threat to that when you take a look at it globally at the number of publications put out by professional societies?
I don't think so. I certainly don't think that they're incompatible. Societies can have and are putting out open access journals. Part of it, I think, is the infrastructure that's required, the editorial infrastructure, the peer review infrastructure. And there's actually free software out there now that lets you manage a peer review journal. Glenn probably knows a little bit about this as well. There's a Canadian software package that lets you do that.
Canada's so-called Public Knowledge Project has been sort of spearheading the open access movement effort. And that group's based at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver. And part of that project involved the development of software known as Open Journal System software that pretty much governs the entire process from manuscript submission
Wow.
group publication.
But somebody.
Somebody
has
still has to
organize
sit in
that
front of
effort
that.
and
Right.
pay
Exactly.
an office to do that. And
Yeah.
traditionally, it's been memberships that have funded that. And if you have open access, then you don't have those fees coming in.
Well,
Lots of
one of the
people
ways
join
those-
societies simply because they want to get to the journal.
Well, that's true, but one of the things that's happening is that the authors are being charged page
Right.
charges to publish in these journals. So, there may be some society journals that are on shaky ground that don't survive this process, but I'd be surprised if we didn't see as many or even more than what we've had in the past.
Well,
Yep.
Yeah,
I have
David?
a question about searching for these articles. The
Yeah.
great advantage of having these open access, of course, is not just people able to read them, but that people
Right.
have some access to a Google-like search.
You gotta
mechanism,
find
a
'em.
single search mechanism
Mhm.
that you can access all of them.
Mhm.
Is that available, or what kind of barriers are there for things like behind EBSCOhost?
Okay.
Things like that?
Well, there's several ways that you can locate these articles. One is through commercial databases, which we pay for, but you're right, there's a paywall there. So we're only allowing our community in for those services. But that's not the only place to go. Google Scholar is trolling for open access material as well as commercial access. So if you search them, you're going to get some of both of those. Now, to me as a librarian, that's not as good a search as a well-constructed database with a thesaurus of subject headings and other information describing the article. You know, what are the populations that are being discussed, or what are the ages of the people being discussed. But there's also the Directory of Open Access Journals has its own search service for about a third of its journals. They have about 6,000, and about 2,400 of them you can actually search through the directory. And then this other service, Oyster, picks up many of those articles as well. So we're not in a place where I can point you to one thing reliably and say, here's where you're going to find all of those.
In your opinion, then, is Google Scholar sort of heading in that direction?
If they're smart, they will. Yeah, one of the problems with them when they first started, and I heard one of the prime folks speak at a conference many years ago, was that some of the commercial publishers would not let them find out what articles they had available, even if the user could not get to them. And that's frustrating with Google Scholar. I'm sure you've had that experience where you found this really great looking article and then it's just not available to you because it's behind some publisher's paywall. Yeah. Now we provide access to some of those, and in fact we've got a link to Google Scholar that gets you our own links to the journals that we receive, the 65 or so thousand that we receive. So I always recommend that you go through our own A to Z list to use that Google Scholar link. Deborah?
What I've done, and I think I've seen the improvement with Google Scholar, is setting up preferences so that if you have access to Loyola, WorldCat, or whatever libraries, then as you're doing your search, it will come up and tell you it's at Loyola, it's at Highwire, and then I always get confused between open URLs and open source and
there's a
link
difference.
resolvers and the magic that makes that happen. But I'm using Google, which I'm comfortable with, but I'm getting to scholarly literature. And then I'm also going then to Google Books, and I saw the Springer collection in Google Books for the first time and was just amazed that Springer, which I thought was, vendors maybe that wouldn't be jumping on board and making a lot of scholarly books available through Google Scholar. So it just seems that every month there are great strides in the quality and the accessibility and maybe even the way we search and how people are using it and tagging it and flagging this information for their colleagues. And I think it's exciting. Maybe we could talk a little at the end about student movement and educating students about open source.
Well, these are exciting times, but they're also transitional times, and we don't quite know where things are going. This again, has only been around 20 years or so, so we don't know whether it's going to take off like the telephone did. I hear that's doing well these days.
Soon. Okay, well, I think
But turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Dorn.
Thank you for coming, and we've already touched on a lot of the sort of key points and issues that are going to come up. But
this is just a preliminary report, and I've just extracted a few of the slides from this study just to try to hit those high points. Things like prestige, recognition, fees, those sorts of things. So I'm just gonna sort of quickly go through this, but I'm happy to have it sort of as a conversation where we're going back and forth. And I guess let's just start with, how many of you have published in open access journals? Or published anything open access? Okay, so not a whole lot yet. So again, this is preliminary, but it's gonna come out very soon. And it's a huge study. So they contacted 1.5 million people. And again, I've extracted just a few slides to not sit here and bore you with slides, but I'm happy to provide the whole thing to whoever wants it. So they so far have over 54,000 answers, and it's across disciplines. And I'm going to scroll the next one. Yeah, it's not a PowerPoint, is it? All right, so it's a large study, lots of people came out of the European Commission, but the important thing here is it's March 2009 to February 2011. And I'm just going to hit the high points here. So they only looked at English language journals, and look at 10% of the publishers publish 2/3 of the open access journals, and there's 14 that are huge, really large publishers. So right now, about 8 to 10% of articles per year are published in open access, or in these hybrid journals that I'll talk about in a minute, with open access.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
If you, is the hybrid, if, you know, Journal of Psychology might make it open access after 5 years, 3 years, or whatever it is. Is that what you mean by hybrid then?
Well,
That's what I think of, yes.
we can talk about that issue now. When we think about fees, I discovered at a meeting, I was in Amsterdam this fall, that regular non-open access journals will sometimes provide your article as open access. And we can talk a little bit more about that when we talk about fees. So to me, that's a hybrid journal. Now, as you say, it's transitional, and there seems to be every permutation, and so an embargoed and then available may be considered hybrid as well.
We're trying out different models, and let's kind of see what sticks,
Right.
what's still around in 100 years.
This I thought was interesting. I left it in because, here's are the big ones. And Jim mentioned Biomed Central, which is commercial. The crystallography is kind of interesting. We've talked about PLOS, Public Library of Science, which I've published in. And what's interesting to me is I've been contacted by both of these, which is Indian and Chinese. And not only is much more science coming out of India and China, but they're jumping on open access publishing in a commercial sense, big time. I'll tell you, they don't always look at your CV very carefully before they ask you to participate in immunology and parasitology or whatever, but I've heard from both of those. And again, like 6 are commercial, 6 are non-commercial, and then there's some where they didn't have information. And as you might expect, it's heavily predominant in the STM fields, science, technology, or science and math. And the large publishers are almost exclusively in the STEM fields. So this is just an overview of the data of what they're doing. There's, it's a limited number of questions. They've got tens of thousands of answers, and they're starting to put it all together. So I just pulled out a few of the slides. They really focused on the active researchers, although there's a few librarians represented there. And this is just of the people responding, how many articles have you published? And then they focused in on the published researchers. Okay, that's who they took the data from, which makes sense to me. United States is overrepresented, but you can see they do have a pretty broad number of countries represented and a lot of people in other. And the sciences are, the natural sciences, and social sciences is pretty well represented in here as well. Not a lot of lawyers, but I did leave the law thing in there to find them.
They wanna have books
Yeah.
so that they're behind them when they take the pictures.
Yeah.
There they are.
This is one of the big take-home messages. 90% of the people think it's beneficial. And I think one of my big take-home messages today is this is here to stay. This is not a fad, or if it is, it's gonna be a while before it goes away and it's replaced by something else. In my field now, if I have NIH funding, and I don't know about NSF, I'm required to publish in an open access journal. Have you all heard that in other fields? Is that true in the humanities?
It's coming, yeah, I've heard
Yeah.
of it, I don't know if
If
it's.
you're
required.
using public funds,
Public funds.
and we'll get to the funding part, because that's another whole issue. But people think it's a great idea. About 8 to 10% are actually being published right now.
How does NIH define open access then?
Open access is completely available.
From the day it hits the press, there's no embargo.
Right.
Embargoes are
No.
forbidden.
Yeah. There's no embargo. Why do we think it's a good idea? Well, for me, I've been pulled this direction strongly by, well, not only funding, but my collaborators are in Guatemala. And whenever I say, I want to publish in this journal, I say, it's got to be open access, or we can't see it. And I did learn that even Elsevier, who can be very commercial, will provide open access to their non-open access journals for the developing world. Now, there's an application process and all, but I learned that as well in the meeting in Amsterdam. So, why do people think it's a good idea? Why do we want to publish in open access? I mean, making it available, I think people are more likely to see it and cite it. It's public funds anyway, so maybe there's a fairness issue there, that if you're.
Well, it's a matter of avoiding financial barriers that might be there in terms of distribution, geographic.
Right.
I think in the final analysis, I view it as somewhat of an ethical issue. And not simply in those circumstances where public funds are used to support the research.
Okay.
But even beyond that, it's a matter of, scientific knowledge being generated and somewhat of an obligation to make that literally as accessible as possible.
Right.
So that's my take.
Is this maybe an outcome of, for past days of sending out reprint request cards by US mail in 14 different languages, so whoever we send it to can read the request?
Yeah.
I mean, for years now, if we're trying to get reprints, you just do it by email.
Right.
And this is even precluding that. Is that kind of the operating concept
Right,
here?
so now you can put a link on your homepage, your webpage, and they can just get all of your articles. Yeah.
Or you scan your article and put it on there and let them come after you if they don't like it.
Yeah. It's a little difficult to understand the wording in those agreements. I just signed one today for publishing something, so.
But I think they're less likely to do that because they're realizing that it can build profitable audience. If one guy downloads yours and somebody says, well, I just want to own this. And I mean, the Oriental Institute in Chicago, we were talking, all their book-length monographs are available to be downloaded in PDF file. And since they've had that policy, this is obscure stuff. Their sales of the hard copies is gone.
Wow, that's interesting.
That makes me think of music sharing, the idea that people
Mhm.
could send music files that somehow undermine, the music industry.
Right. So we've touched on a few of these issues. And I think a lot of this is going to sort out as we work through the transition. there are people who publish in vanity presses, and they're hard copy, and they're paying themselves. And as we see, some people, like lawyers, do pay to publish. So these are some of the concerns that we've talked around. Is it lesser quality? Well, I'll agree with Craig. PLOS, Neglected Tropical Diseases, and some of the other PLOS journals are very high quality and very rigorous review. Now, PLOS 1 is kind of a funny beast, because if you don't get into one of the regular PLOS journals, supposedly as long as the science is good, you can go there. So to me, that's like a second tier. So that's one of the issues.
That's really no different than, hard copy publication has always been a
Right,
hierarchy.
exactly. And I think that's what's gonna sort out, and this whole idea of they're not as valuable as a print copy is gonna fritter away.
I think with old print publications, there have been certain artificial barriers, maybe. There's only a certain number of issues per year, maybe, or only a certain number of pages that they can print for issue. And with the online, that's not the case. So you just have those artificial barriers against publishing whatever's good rather than what's good, and we can publish this quarter are removed too.
And honestly, that's kind of more of an online versus not online compared to, as opposed to an open. But it's one of my I guess, issues with all this is the massive proliferation of material out there. Because there's no longer the financial pressures to keep the articles short. Sometimes it's wonderful to have all that supplementary material available.
Well, that's where the
but it's
search
just
things come in,
exploding.
I think. And the next step would be some sort of algorithm or search mechanism that would collate that and translate that and somehow organize that, which is really gonna create some sort of synergy that we don't have now.
But even before the era of online publishing, people were complaining that there was too much information out there. There were too many journals to keep up with, so.
And now it's exploded.
It's not, yeah.
But
right.
is the editorial, the review process the same? In terms of that massive amount of material that's being submitted for an online journal, how are the editors or the review boards keeping up with it? So it's also pushing them, it seems, I'm not trying to answer my own question, in a way of using new tools, because the last thing you need is people to say, how could they let that through? Look at all those typos, look at, whatever.
Well, several of the societies that I'm involved in have, I would describe it as hybrid open access, and have been debating, having the whole journal open access and all the editorial, and they have their own editorial structure already, and their reviewers and all. And they said, no matter what, we're not gonna increase the number of articles we publish. No matter what, because it's going to eat it, we won't be able to review them. But it lets them publish something bigger than, the articles can be physically larger. And that doesn't mean unedited, it means, the things that they always made you throw away, tables and, all this stuff that's actually, can be very valuable, that is opened up. And so there's probably, like everything else, like email creep, now we have to reply in 5 seconds rather than a day or 2 days or whatever with a physical whatever. So there's probably more pressure to have more articles, but I don't think I think all that, the editorial process is gonna keep it from just really being an order of magnitude more. I don't think it'll be an order of
I agree,
magnitude.
if the editorial process remains the same.
Right.
It's interesting too to notice the why, the number of people who answered, it was almost 7,000. Here it's about 1,500. So
Right.
a lot fewer people expressing negative opinions.
Right.
What are they saying on the companies that unsustainable for publication in society? What does that mean?
Right, so I think that gets into the funding issue. Because who's paying for this? I'm guessing that's what that means.
Okay, and what's the one below it?
The green open access enough, I'm assuming that has to do with whether you're using trees to handle it, more of an online issue than an open access issue. I'm guessing. That's what I interpreted green.
Yeah, the green, I think, has more to do with the kind of publication it is.
Oh, is that the green gold thing
Is
that you
it,
want to
yeah,
remember?
yeah,
Okay.
that's the green.
Okay.
Yeah, there may be some societies that don't have the financial means to set up journals. kind of guessing what they mean by that.
Has there been any movement in the search engines to identify the nature of the review process that they could, so that the data, if you get a journal you're not familiar with, you can have an idea of whether it's just totally open access, somebody just plopped it out there, is versus, you know.
Some of the commercial indexes that we have a limiter. I want only, they call it scholarly, but that usually translates to peer-reviewed material. Because many of them cover popular as well as scholarly material. But I don't know how high the quality is of their judgment on that.
Well, I'm not to hear what Patricia has to say about how all of this is being paid for.
Okay, so, you know, of course, everybody thinks they would be beneficial, but just to note that it's not just the hard sciences, but a lot of,
I think that doing something like this, I'm in literature, and I think doing something like this in my field would be a huge risk, because until everyone adopts it, no one can. You know what I mean? If I were to try to go up for tenure with, 6 open access articles, I would not get tenure, I don't think,
Wow.
right?
No, you
People
could.
haven't adopted it yet.
Depends on the climate.
It depends,
No,
it
but
depends.
that's a journal decision. If you are published in a peer-reviewed journal, and the decision sometimes to whether your article is made public or not is not even yours.
Well, sure. If I have a journal that is in print and they also let mine go, or they let mine go open access, I think that's actually a good sign, right? That they chose your article to be the one that's advertising for their journal. I'm sure that's fine. But I mean, if I were to choose to publish, because I think it is an ethical issue, to publish in my field, which is slavery, so that anyone can read about it, I think that's important. That's a big deal. But if I were to publish only in things that are open access, I would not have access to the best journals in my field, none of which are open access. And so, do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
so until we all adopt it, we all are hesitant about it because we don't want to be the one who gets burned for it.
right, and I think that's the whole issue, like Craig was talking about in terms of the quality of the journals, and PLOS has established their quality and their rigor of review, and it's kind of nice because it's beyond open access, it's also open review, or can be. So the reviewers are named, and then people comment on the article, and it becomes a discussion. And so, we know which ones are quality, because it's been in the sciences long enough, so I think it's just time when it gets
So-
into the humanities.
Are you saying this is kind of a wiki review? Anybody that wants to put?
No, the reviews are separate, and you can choose, it's just, it's the same as normal peer review. It's just you can choose to reveal your name, and they're a little more polite, I've noticed. when you meet.
Well, that trend toward transparency, I think, is an important one, and that's where I see it going. There's some discussion now as to have scientists publish their research as they're doing it, sort of have an open window onto their research process. And so this idea that what's published online and its value is only the finished product maybe is being questioned.
That's another.
Well, there are some preprint servers out there. The archive server for physics, mathematics, and related fields has been out there for almost 20 years. So in some cases, you can at least get a preliminary version of somebody's study, if not the study as they're doing the work.
So here's some of the things we've touched on. Some of the positive aspects. Research is available. I really haven't noted or cared or thought too much about whether you retain your own copyright. We generally sign everything away because we're so anxious to publish and they require it, so we just do it. I don't know if that's more of an issue for others. Certainly it's more available, can be cited. And again, once the journals have established their quality, then I think, people go to PLOS. More cost effective. You mentioned that with respect to the cost to the university. This I wouldn't say is neutral. I would say this is negative, and one of the big negatives is somebody has to pay for this, and if the authors pay, although I have paid charges in a print publication as well. I'm not too concerned about research-intensive institutions having to pay more.
But the permutation that I'm used to seeing is you don't pay page charges if you're a member of the society, or you're allowed one, maybe two journal articles a year, and you have to pay page charges if you publish more than.
Unless you want color or something.
Yeah. But everybody, that if there's not a member of the society that's at least on the list of authors, of course that means some people get invited, you know, whether they did
Right.
anything.
So these are, again, are some of the issues we've touched on. Is this leading to a proliferation of low quality or poorly reviewed? You know, and then I thought this was kind of funny, especially with respect to your ethical issues, and we should have the information available out there to say, oh, the public can't handle it. We really shouldn't put all this information out, but
Well, there's a couple people for ethical issues go that way, because they're chemists and their publications lead to illegal drugs and deaths reported due to a drug that's been synthesized according to your publication. It must be, so, I mean, some of those guys have their own ethical issues.
Knowledge strangers.
That's been with us a long time, though.
Yeah.
That kind of.
But again, it wouldn't be available to people if it was restricted to journals that are just, you don't get them unless you're a member of the society.
I think people can
Or you
find
walk
them
in the library.
So this is just how many
The library can
articles,
afford it.
But they'd be traced that way.
you know, half of the people had published 1 to 5.
Only
This is just the
The
study.
library gave up the names. You don't check them out, so the name's not there.
So why don't do this? And funding, to me, is one of the big issues. And when I first went, you know, this is very new, and when I got my most recent NIH grant, I didn't put any money. Of course, you know, you're trying to squeeze all you can out of the grant anyway, and we didn't put anything in there, and they said it's $2,000 to publish this article. Okay, and I discovered that, one, you can negotiate it. So I wrote them a nice letter and said, you know, I'm at this liberal arts school, I'm very poor, I don't have any money, and will you take $1,000? And they said, happily, we'll take $1,000. But I did learn, and so, you know, that's an issue for us when we're talking about, do we publish open access? Oh, we can't afford it. But I did learn that some publishers, like Elsevier, if you are publishing under NIH funding, they will give you free open access for your article, even though they're not an open access journal. They will provide open access for your article because NIH requires it.
Mm-hmm.
That's interesting. So, yeah, I think again this is transitional. I don't know how long Elsevier's gonna do that.
So one would assume that their motivation is to make sure that their journal still attracts NIH-funded research, otherwise they're not gonna be able to sell it.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, this is sort of a surprise to me. Is this common practice in your experience where open access publication is charged? I mean, you mentioned these different models before, but I mean, is that unusual? Is that?
I think it's my next
You mean page turn?
slide.
I think it's the rule,
It's the
from
rule?
what I've read.
So this is their survey.
Okay.
Oh, there you
And
go.
so this was kind of interesting to me because
You
that,
don't have to.
you know, look at that, more than 3,000 euro. Of course, it's a small number, but still. You know, even the 1,300, that's where I guess that 2,000 would fall, 10%.
This sort of runs contrary to the previous slide, where funding was cited as a main reason
Right.
for not going the route of open access.
But
It
again,
seems to
that's-
contradict this, and my general impression with the open access publishing movement is sort of the opposite in terms of what you said, in terms of one of the benefits being that no subscription fee, no per page author fees.
But somebody's paying for this.
Right, or it could be a society or a foundation.
Right. But these large, like, lots, I mean, it's $2,000.
This may not be contradictory to the previous slide. I mean, 50% no charge, but maybe the previous model was 20%.
Well,
you know what I mean?
But if you can't afford to pay the fee, you know, I I mean, we still have the same problem. If the author, the scientist can't afford to pay, then you don't get published, so your science, your research, your literature does not get, you know, so it's kind of like we're dismantling one model in this,
And it begins to feel like a vanity press thing to me, and I think if we're in tenure discussions, this would probably come up.
Does this mean the one you paid to publish or the one you paid to read?
No, this is that you paid to publish.
This one, okay.
Right, if you pay $4,000 for an article, I wanna know what they're writing about.
And then I'm
Well,
surprised that you have
Get in
14%.
they know it's extramural funded research, well, they had $500,000 in the grant.
Now, I do think most journals will waive fees for developing countries. And more are being published there, so, you know, that may be a big chunk. You know, we negotiated down by half. Elsevier, I didn't realize, but we're sending one in saying, and by the way, this is NIH funded and we don't wanna pay. But it's certainly, it's a big issue. And again, we just submitted a proposal in December, and yeah, we know about this now, so we did try to think of it, but you're trying to squeeze out so much from these grants. So, you know, I think the argument that this means there's less money to do the research is valid. There's, you know, publication charges. So let's see what else.
But
Now-
Tricia, in your experience for the kind of journals
Mhm.
that you submitted to,
Right.
page charges in traditional journals or the fees in the online journals, about how much does it cost to publish a paper? Give me an idea of the range and the average that
Well,
you.
the PLOS asked for $2,000, and the page charges I've paid, it's been a while, but it was maybe $100 a page, it was maybe like $500, not 2,000, but not insignificant. And there's a lot more slides about who pays for this, and what countries pay better, and what institutions pay better, but this is just one I kept. I mean, 12% of them paid it themselves. Which again, does that get into that vanity press thing? It kind of smells like that, which is just a little bit, you know, these lines are a little fuzzier now. So 30% more or less research funding, you budgeted for it, or you didn't budget for it, or my institution paid. I mean, I did kind of think that if I was ready to go and this was accepted and only had to be published, that might be one thing the dean would cover. But it's a big issue.
Well, you know, one way that the journals force the issue is generally you gotta sign a document when you submit it that you haven't submitted anywhere else.
Right.
I mean, if you wanted to play the game hardball, you could submit it someplace else and take the best offer if it gets accepted. I
You
know
don't
how
want to
ethical-
submit it simultaneously
Yeah,
to more than
well.
one place. That will get you.
I just wondered how they figure out the fees. You mentioned it was negotiable, but I'm trying to imagine what justification they could give for the $2,000 original fee.
I don't know who came up with that
Yeah.
and how they arrived at that.
Administrative, computer, equipment.
If it's
So this one-
Elsevier, they're just trying to maximize the profit.
Yeah, probably.
This one I just left in because I thought it was kind of funny that
Oh.
lawyers pay for their own and biologists won't pay for anything. And then generally, and again, there's many more slides going into all kinds of detail about this, but half the people thought it was really difficult to get the funds, and a third thought it was easy.
You know, that last slide might also tell you a little bit about what fields have accepted this as a reasonable route, right? Because literature's up there, and there's no way I would get somebody to pay to publish an article. They would say, if you have to pay to publish an article, you're in big trouble in English, right? But in biology, maybe you guys have people who pay for things because it's
We have to
practice.
get grant funding to do our
You
research
get the grant
anyway.
funding anyway, yeah.
Loyola has a mechanism.
What's that?
Faculty research grants have paid page charges in the past when somebody's been up against the wall.
Yeah, well, in literature, we just don't, I mean, who would pay to publish
Yeah,
an
for
article
the
in literature?
humanities in general.
Yeah,
Yeah.
who would pay to publish an article?
Can't get my mind around that.
Yeah, I feel so naive, I really didn't know that you all paid charges, because
Yeah.
when you get a grant, when you publish, it is the review, it's the peer review, it's except you have already gone through the rigor of doing the research, and it's published, and the society is paid for through memberships and library subscriptions. So I'm really kind of stunned, and now stunned that you would have to pay these for open source. I mean, what if you put your research on a local repository, in our repository? Will they pick it up?
Nobody's gonna look at my research unless it's been published by a peer-reviewed journal.
But you can say it's been peer-reviewed and approved, I didn't pay the fee. How
many search engines have never done
Like
it?
10 closest colleagues.
I pulled it.
I'll tell you, there were fireworks at this meeting because people are concerned about these fees, and now we're talking about, you know, some for-profit journals, and we're saying, we do all the reviewing for nothing, and it's hours and hours, and the editor just exploded. He'd say, other people are reviewing your articles, and get over it, that's part of your job. And so it got pretty lively. But it's interesting, if you're in industry, they'll pay for it, not a problem. But university or colleges, it's a little more challenging. Medical schools say it's really difficult, that's kind of funny. Okay, so I think, you know, the bottom line is, most of, at least in the natural sciences, we think it's a great idea. Right now, we're at about 10% market penetration, if that's the right term, or open access. The main barriers right now are funds, and then this whole quality prestige issue, and it sounds like it's much more of an issue in some fields than others. But I guess my take home is it's here to stay. It's required now. It's not a question. So it's certainly accepted. And we already have enough experience that there's a hierarchy of journals. So I guess that's kind of my main points, but I'm happy to hear further. This is a website, and anybody who wants the whole presentation, and there's a much longer article, and you know, the full study will be published soon, so please just send me an email, I'm happy to send it.
So do you have any feedback from NIH these days now that they're requiring open access publication about their willingness to include a budget line that is generous relative to publication costs?
Oh, they absolutely expect it.
Okay.
I mean, it's
So the
it's
fact
in
that you
there.
did, what you explained a little while ago, that it was simply the transition process, you got caught in the transition.
Yeah, so my first one I was caught, but this round, I have to say, you know, it sounds like so much money, but you know, when you're dividing it into the supplies and all the, and hiring students in the summer, and you gotta come up with several thousands of dollars to publish.
Hey, an honors thesis to work for a summer for what it costs to publish the paper.
Exactly. So that's one of my biggest issues.
I have to say, I'm perplexed where I don't know of people in law who pay to get stuff published. And I know it kept popping up. I don't know those journals.
I was kind of needling the lawyers,
But-
I think the other thing to pay attention to is the first outline of who responded. There were very few from law that were part of the pool. So this may represent, you know, this is preliminary results. It's just the first several months of the study. So when they get more representation, maybe that will
Well,
even
and
out.
peer review for law is so completely different also, because, I mean, most law journals and law reviews are run by second-year law students instead of, you know, law faculty other places. So the review process is just radically different than most other. So this was eye-opening to me because it's just so foreign to my background.
So how many of you think you would want to publish in an open access journal?
As long as I don't have to pay.
So don't forget to negotiate. It's possible. Any other questions, comments? Great. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Appreciate it. Use this.
Thank you. Thank you.
And I don't,